Star Trek: The Next Generation, Starfleet Academy, Number 5, Atlantis Station, Chapter 7. He was perched on a vertical sheet of cracked and broken rock. How the robot had gotten up the cliff, Geordi couldn't guess. He wasn't sure how to get it down either. Even someone with lots of experience using remote equipment would have trouble getting out of this position. Straight below him, rounded boulders and jagged blocks of dark rock littered the ocean floor. He turned his head, and a cone of light followed the movement. Anything situated more than a few feet away was blurred by the murky water. The ground shivered beneath him. Pressure pulses like waves passing pushed against his right side. Curious, he looked in that direction. At the edge of his vision, dense black smoke billowed from an irregular column of rock. Geordi struggled to see what was happening. Suddenly, as if he were zooming through the water, the boiling clouds jumped in front of him. He tried to make out the details, but the light was too poor. Whether the robot's lenses were focused close or far, the light from his spotlight determined what Geordi saw. To get a better look, he had to get closer. How was he going to get down the cliff? Geordi wondered. There were almost as many kinds of remotely operated robots as there were jobs for them to do. Nobody had said anything about what type of robot he was using. That meant either that he should already know how to run the robot, or that the directions were readily available. Geordi decided the information must be somewhere in the computer. He just had to figure out where. If, like his classmates, he had used the helmets before, he would know the answer. What was the correct command? Computer reached the main system on a starship or in certain areas of the academy. It didn't work everywhere, though. Geordi chuckled, remembering a classmate who had asked for the answers during the test. The computer in this station seemed much like a starship's. If he had designed the system, Geordi thought, he would have used a different command to access the robot's controls. Robot, he whispered into his microphone. Nothing happened, and his robot remained motionless. Command and control didn't work either. He was starting to feel desperate. He'd never be able to face his classmates if he had to ask for the command. Remote? A menu in soft green letters appeared on the lower corner of his view. His left pinky moved the cursor. He flipped through his choices. Everything he needed was there. Relieved, Geordi asked how to make the robot move. It took several minutes to sort through the directions. His robot could do many different things. It was, he discovered, a high-powered research and exploration unit designed to work in dangerous environments. Rugged and durable, it could withstand years of hard work under harsh conditions. If Geordi wanted, he could drop the robot off the cliff without hurting it. He could not, however, float himself free. For all its abilities, this robot was a walker, a ground-based unit. In an emergency, he could dump his samples and head for the surface. Once. The robot would have to be serviced before it returned to the ocean's floor. Geordi thought about taking the quick route down. What would happen, though, if the robot landed on its back? He looked, but that information wasn't in the manual. If he was lucky, he could get the robot turned over. But if he wasn't, he'd have to call for help. That convinced him. He checked his equipment list, looking for another way down. After a moment, he found his answer, a tether line. He searched the rock face for an anchor point. The grapples on his 8 legs were firmly embedded in cracks in the rock, but those places wouldn't hold the line. He needed something he could tie it around. Geordi went back to his equipment list. There had to be a way to anchor his line to the rock. After 3 times through, he was about to give up. Everything he found would leave him permanently fastened to this spot. Then inspiration struck. The robot had a drill for taking rock samples. All he had to do was take a sample through the slab of rock. He ordered the robot to begin drilling. The robot's side opened, and a flexible arm snaked out. Geordi wiggled his fingers in the control gloves. He was surprised at how little effort it took to move the robot's arm. When he had the drill in position, he chose the Go command. The arm went rigid, and the high-speed drill bored into the rock. Through the helmet, he heard the whir and rasp of the bit. The sounds were much softer than if he had been there, but they still set his teeth on edge. The scene bobbed and jerked from the vibrations. Much sooner than Geordi expected, the drill cut through the rock. Quickly, he turned the drill off. The arm pulled itself and the rock core back into its compartment. Geordi considered throwing the rock sample away. After all, he hadn't chosen that spot because the rock was particularly interesting. The robot would travel faster if it wasn't carrying the extra weight. Still, how many of his classmates would collect rock samples at all? He might score a few extra points for bringing back a typical sample. In the end, Geordi kept the rock. Maybe, if he collected enough information, he could make up the piloting points he had lost this morning. To go with his sample, he ordered the robot's computer to record continuous temperature and water chemistry data. It was time to get off the cliff. Geordi looped his tether line through the hole. Bringing the loose end around, he sealed the locket to the cable. It would hold until he released it. Once he was sure the cable was anchored firmly, Geordi began working himself loose. One by one, he released the grapples and pulled the robot's legs against its body. Slowly, he paid out the tether line. The robot inched down the cliff. At first it was easy. All Geordi had to do was pay out the line. If he went too fast, the robot swung into the cliff face. About halfway down, it started twisting as well. The combined motions made his head spin. Geordi grabbed sight of the cliff with his robot. That didn't stop the scene in his helmet from swaying back and forth. The robot and the rocks it was attached to were still moving. An earthquake was shaking the seafloor. What should he do now? The earthquake lasted over a minute. Large rocks tumbled past him. The water slowed the falling boulders, but not enough. They could still damage the remote. Geordi kept his robot clamped to its perch, hoping nothing would hit it. When things quit shaking around the robot, Geordi slumped back in his chair. He felt drained, almost as if he had been out there himself. "Computer, tell me about that earthquake." "The earthquake registered 8.3 on the Richter scale," the computer said in his earphones. "It was centered 1,000 kilometers north-northwest of this station and occurred 5 kilometers below the ocean floor." 8.3 on the Richter scale, Geordi thought. That was a major earthquake. No wonder his robot had bounced around so much. It must have been very close to the center of the quake. He tipped the helmet away from one ear. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the fans and the scritch of fingers moving on the counter. The other cadets, including Leilani, were calmly working their controls. As far as he could tell, no one else had felt the earthquake. His must be the only robot in that area. Getting his bearings back, Geordi straightened his helmet. His robot was where he'd left it, halfway down the cliff. Off to his right, bigger clouds of black smoke poured out of the rock chimneys than before. "It isn't really smoke," he reminded himself. The streams of hot, chemical-laden water billowed and twisted like dense black smoke from a major fire. The first scientists who saw the rock columns with their streams of metal-rich water had called them black smokers. The name stuck. He looked for the best way to get close to the chimneys. With luck, he could sample them. He grinned to himself. The deep oceans were so remote and so hard to reach that every sample was important. Even after centuries of studying the black smokers, geologists were still learning how they worked. First, Geordi had to get the robot off the cliff. He looked back along his tether line. When he released his holds, the robot would swing like a pendulum. That thought was enough to make his stomach do flip-flops. Geordi buried the robot's grapples deeper into the rock. A pulse of current along the tether line released the locket. He reeled in the line, drilled another hole, and tied off the tether. With the shorter line, He lowered himself to the bottom of the cliff. Even then, it was rough going. The ground wasn't as level as it had looked from above. Boulders and rocks of many sizes were scattered everywhere. Narrow cracks and deep holes waited to swallow him. He started off, picking his way through the obstacles. At first, it was very difficult. Geordi wasn't used to working with remotes. The control gloves were extremely sensitive, and they translated small twitches of his fingers into large motions of the robot's legs. It would have been much easier, he thought, if he'd gotten a floating robot. After 10 minutes, he got the hang of running the robot. It was a matter of practice, of repeating the commands until he didn't have to think about them. The robot's speed picked up. He was almost to the base of the nearest chimney. The robot's spotlight showed Geordi a strange and fantastic sight. Hot water streamed through cracks in the seafloor. When it mixed with the cold ocean water, chemicals in the water formed tiny crystals of iron oxide and other minerals. There were so many of them that the water looked black. As the crystals settled to the ocean floor, they made irregular mounds and knobby towers of rock. Patches of red and orange and black spotted the rocks. Feathery particles floated past the robot's eye. Geordi moved the robot around a low hill. On the other side, he stopped. Several dozen white clams grew beside a small crack in the ocean floor. To one side, a few short, stubby tubes clustered together. Eyeless worms lived in the tubes, and 3 of them were snapping at the water. He wondered what they were trying to catch. He knew that they were tube worms, polychaetes. It was too good a chance to miss. Geordi moved the robot nearer to the worms. He used his camera and sensors to record them from every angle, and he also took water samples from the crack. I wish I could take one of the worms, too, he thought. However, his equipment list didn't have anything that would hold one. Besides, it would kill the worm. His robot wasn't built to collect living samples. The computer told him his samples wouldn't be retrieved for almost 3 weeks. That was when the service robot was due to visit this area. He could still take rock and water samples. With a last look at the clams, Geordi returned to his original plan. There were so many interesting things to see in his area. His report would be the best ever written by a Starfleet cadet. Geordi had been so busy observing the black smoker and collecting samples that he lost track of the time. Once he got used to the control gloves and helmet, the work was more like a game. A game where the person who collects the most data wins, Geordi thought. He was determined to win this time. Suddenly, his world went black. The darkness was as complete and as shocking as if someone had yanked his visor off his face. At the same time, his seat vibrated like a shuttle fighting a high wind. It felt like a huge dog was shaking the station in its mouth. "What's happening? Earthquake! Where are the lights?" His classmates' questions mixed together and overlapped. Geordi removed the helmet and fumbled for his visor. It wasn't where he'd left it. He reached farther, trying to find it. It seemed like forever, but it was only a few seconds before his fingers closed around the familiar smoothness of the visor. It had bounced to the back of the counter. With relief, Geordi slid it over his eyes. The room was still shaking. This was lasting a long time. Even the biggest earthquakes didn't usually last more than a minute. He wished he had started counting immediately when it began. Now it was too late. He had no idea how long it had been since the earthquake started. "Where are the lights?" Alyssa asked. "Aren't there any backup systems?" Todd demanded. They were all sweating, and everyone but Tavarian was breathing in quick, shallow gasps. What they were experiencing was known as fight-or-flight response. Geordi wished he wasn't getting so much practical review for his biology class. At that, the flight portion of the fight-or-flight response sounded like a good idea. No one here would have time for a group of cadets after that earthquake. The scientists would be far too busy doing their work. Geordi wasn't as nervous as his classmates, but he was sure that was because he could still see. He would have felt much differently if he hadn't found his visor. The lights came on slowly, flickering and dimming. Something is wrong, Geordi thought. The emergency lights should have gone on immediately. Instead, the secondary, battery-powered system had taken over 2 minutes to begin working. He looked for Chris to ask her what was happening. She wasn't there. That shouldn't surprise him, he supposed. They had been working with their remotes. There was no reason for her to be in the room all the time. Leilani tapped her communicator. Computer, report status of station. There was no response. Geordi tried his communicator with no better luck. He frowned, trying to remember what he knew about space station design. He was sure that the construction engineers had used similar ideas to build this undersea dome. Most stations were made from separate modules. The computer and the power plant were in the central core. All the sections were linked by thick, flexible tubes that carried the electrical and computer cables. If the station's hull started leaking, the tubes could be sealed. Pressure doors, like the ones Geordi had examined earlier, closed off the corridors. In theory, each section should be able to function independently in an emergency. They had battery power for lights and air circulation. Food and water weren't a problem because rescue teams could reach them in less than 6 hours. Geordi touched his rebreather again to reassure himself. Power and computer access had been cut off to their section of the station, and he hoped that wasn't where the leak was. However, it was a possibility they had to consider. A sharp jolt shook them. The floor heaved and tossed like a raft on a choppy sea. The walls groaned, protesting the motion. The earthquake went on and on. 30 seconds, 1 minute, 1 minute and 19 seconds. Even after it stopped, Geordi felt like he was still moving. "I want out of here," Liz's voice cracked. "I believe we should make our way to the shuttle." Tavarian sounded calm, but Geordi saw the telltale, jerky movements of her hands. Leilani tried her communicator again, but there was still no response. "I don't like this," she said, frowning. A siren wailed in the corridor. It held at full volume for over a minute. "Evacuation alert," a man's voice announced. "All personnel proceed to the nearest docking port. This is not a drill." "What do we do?" Liz asked. "I don't know where any of the docking ports are." "I do." Leilani's voice was firm. She radiated confidence, although Geordi could see that she was nervous too. "I think Tavarian is right. We should return to our shuttle." Leilani walked to the door and tapped the control pad. It didn't open. She waved her hand in front of the sensor. Nothing happened, even though the door should have opened. The safety systems were designed to get people out of damaged buildings. Geordi examined the door. It wasn't a pressure door, which meant it wasn't holding them here because the corridor was flooded. His visor should detect the sensor beams controlling the door, but he couldn't see anything. The sensors weren't working. "We've got to find the override panel," he said. The clones began poking at the wall. "In most civilian stations," Amaray said, "they hide the controls behind a plate." Amaral picked up the sentence. "Usually about eye level on the left side." Todd snorted. "Whose eye level? How do we know how tall the person was who installed those controls?" "Oh, of course!" That was the point, Geordi realized. Starfleet buildings were standardized. Knowing your way around one starbase meant you knew your way around every starbase. That made it easier for people to find things when they started a new assignment. With civilian buildings, visitors didn't need to know where the access panels were. And Atlantis Station, in spite of the many Starfleet officers working there, was a civilian post. Amaral and Amaray hadn't found the panel. Geordi crossed his fingers and guessed that it was high. His visor gave him an advantage, but it wasn't helping much. Whoever had hidden the panel had done a thorough job. He had almost given up when he saw a faint line on the wall. Then he knew why finding the controls had been so hard. The cover was shielded to hide the heat produced by the circuits. Geordi was reaching for the panel when the floor began moving again. It shook harder and harder, throwing him off his feet. The emergency lights went out, plunging everything into blackness. The siren quit, its silence ominous and threatening. The room tilted and lurched, tossing Geordi about. Gasps and groans, accompanied by dull thuds, came from his classmates. The station creaked, groaned, and shrieked. Beyond the door, plastic shattered and crashed on the floor. Water splashed against the wall. "We're doomed," Geordi thought. He waited for the water to pour under the door. Nothing happened, although the station continued to bounce. Geordi pressed himself against the floor. He didn't want to get hurt now. He wasn't sure how they would get out of this mess, but he did know one thing. Their chances were much better if they all could walk. Chapter 8. Finally, the station quit shaking. Geordi pushed himself slowly to his knees. The floor tilted, no longer level. We're in big trouble, he thought. Sweat trickled off his forehead, but he was also shivering. He touched his rebreather, making sure he still had it. It looked like they would need their emergency equipment. His classmates called to one another, asking who was hurt. Geordi ignored them. He was listening to the station noises. Each creak and groan had a story to tell. He knew the station was very strong. It had to be, since it was in a dangerous and unstable environment. However, they had just been through 3 major earthquakes. How much more shaking could the station withstand? I want out of here, Lissa said. Everybody stay calm, Leilani ordered. The rescue teams will be here soon. Geordi looked toward her. His visor showed him her body temperature, and that told him she was lying. He looked for the others. Everyone seemed all right except Ven. He crawled to the Andorian. Ven was unconscious. Like the rest of them, he had been bumped around a lot. His antennae were mashed against his head. Not broken, Geordi decided after checking them carefully. However, for Andorians, injuries to their antennae were serious. When he woke up, Ven was going to feel like the entire station had fallen on his head. Will someone look after Ven? He asked. Amril and Amre were closest. They followed his voice to Ven's side. I do not think it is logical for us to remain here, Tavarian said. Given the severity of the earthquakes we just experienced, I believe we should obey the evacuation order. Honorable Tavarian is correct. Yoshi sounded completely calm. Samurai who does not save himself is unworthy to live. But we're trapped in here, Todd said. We can't get the door open. I think I know where the switch is. Geordi crawled to the door. I found the panel just before that last earthquake hit. Get us out of here! Finding the panel was harder with the power off. Without the telltale heat readings, Geordi had to rely on his sense of touch. Even after it was open, he didn't know the circuit layouts, and he had to guess where the switch was. It took several tries to find it. I've got it, he said. Are we ready to go? We don't know what will happen out there. Lissa's voice shook. This may be the only safe place on the station. She has a point, Todd said. If we haven't been rescued, maybe this is the only intact sector. I don't think so, Geordi said. But those earthquakes may have shaken the station loose from its moorings. Earthquakes of that magnitude often cause landslides. Tavarian sounded like she was thinking out loud. Geordi felt a moment's surprise that her ideas agreed with his. The rocks beneath the station could have given way, she concluded. Then we'll fall to the bottom of the ocean and they'll never rescue us, Lissa began crying. Why did I ever want to live on a planet? Space stations are so much safer. Geordi struggled to keep from laughing. Billions of people still believe space is too dangerous a place for humanoids to live. Lissa's reaction put their situation into perspective. I think Tavarian is right, Leilani said. However, the mooring cables are anchored into bedrock. We need to get to the shuttle before the cables break. What about everyone else? Geordi asked. Should we look for other survivors? We have to go through the research areas to get to the shuttle, Leilani answered. We'll look for others on our way out. What about the research that people have been doing? Tavarian asked. If the station is destroyed, all the records will be lost. Not everything. Leilani paused. But a lot of today's reports will be lost. Most people store their backup records in the main computer on the island, but some don't update their files as often as they should. Lose all that data? Geordi shuddered. The point of Atlantis Station's work was to learn how to predict earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The earthquakes they had just been through showed how important that work was. It also proved that the scientists didn't have all the answers. Could we collect the data chips while we're searching the labs for people? He asked. We won't have time to get everything, but it's better than nothing. I'm not going to waste my time on a bunch of stupid data chips, Todd yelled. I'm getting out of here. You are going to collect those chips, Leilani ordered. We all are. It takes 5 seconds to empty the main storage drawer, if you're far enough into the room to make sure there's no one inside. You can't make me waste my time on data chips. I won't do it. I rank you, Cadet Devereaux. I will use the number of isolinear data chips you retrieve to decide whether you have checked the labs thoroughly for survivors. Is that clear? After a long pause, Todd answered, Yes, sir. The others mumbled their agreement. Geordi didn't think anyone liked the idea. He too would prefer to run straight for their shuttle. However, they had a duty to rescue any injured people and as much of the station's data as they could. Are we ready? Leilani asked. Let's go. Taking a deep breath, Geordi pulled the override. He hoped their guesses weren't too far off the mark. What dangers waited for them on the other side of the door? The door crept open in short, unsteady jerks. Obviously, no one had tested the manual system since the station was built. Geordi held his breath, hoping the gears weren't too gummed up. The door stopped halfway open, and he couldn't budge it further. He glanced at the others. For most of them, the narrow opening wasn't a problem. However, Ven, who had regained consciousness, was still dizzy and confused. He leaned on Amaral and Amray for support, and they could barely keep him moving. Geordi gave the door another shove, but nothing happened. If the other doors were in similar shape, they would have trouble rescuing either the scientists or their data. Either way, they couldn't stay here. Let's go, he said. He squeezed through the opening. While he waited for the others to join him, he tried his communicator. There was still no response. Either no one was in range, or the station shielded his transmissions too well. He looked around. A weak, battery-powered emergency light flickered at the end of the hall. The floor was littered with broken plastic from one of the fish tanks on the wall. The water and algae had splashed all over the floor, making it wet and slippery. Some of the dying plants gave off a faint greenish glow. Between that and the emergency lights, the others could see what they were doing. No other people were in sight. Geordi picked up a piece of the plastic, fingering the sharp edge. His visor showed him the residual stress patterns in the material, but it didn't tell him which type of plastic it was. One of the newer ones, he guessed. They were often designed for specific jobs, especially in places where long exposure to metal was undesirable. He couldn't think of any reason to keep the plastic, but it had a sharp edge. On impulse, he put it in his belt pack. Amaral and Amray helped Ven through the lab's door. They were the last ones out. The Andorian was very disoriented. Leilani examined Ven. I think he'll be all right, she said. We don't have much choice about moving him. Like none, Todd said. I'm not going to wait here with him for the medical rescue team. That is unworthy thought, Honorable Todd. One should protect fallen comrades, so they may rise to continue fighting. True samurai have no fear of death. Yoshi seemed perfectly assured of his position. Todd glared at him. If it's all right with you, I'd rather get out of here before this thing falls off the mountainside. As if to underline his words, the floor lurched sideways. The station bounced a couple of times, settling its mooring cables. The walls groaned. Let's not argue, Leilani said. Geordi, Todd, and Yoshi, check the labs on the left side of the hall. Tavarian, Lissa, and I will get the labs on the right side. Amaral and Amray, get Ben to the shuttle. Move it! Geordi took the first door on his side of the corridor. A glowing red patch marked the emergency door released. He slapped the red spot, threw the cover aside, and pulled the lever. The door slid open easily. He entered the room. The counters held an incredible framework of pipes, tanks, and equipment. Most of the tanks had fallen to the floor and shattered. A few were still in place, filled with bizarre-looking sea animals. Farther into the room, Geordi stepped on something soft. His foot slid out from under him, and he landed on his rear, hard. It took a minute to catch his breath. Just beyond his foot was a palm-sized white clam, similar to the ones he'd seen with his robot. He started to stand, and then he saw the body. The scientist had been old. Almost old enough to retire, Geordi thought. He was very, very dead. Fighting for control of his stomach, Geordi forced himself to his feet. With his head turned away from the body, he reached for the data storage rack. He dumped the data chips into his belt pouch and ran from the room. Much to his relief, the next 4 labs he checked were empty. He circled through each room quickly, grabbed the data chips, and hurried out. The station hadn't moved again, but little creaks and groans reminded him that the structure could shift at any time. The last lab held another body. Even though the woman was much closer to his own age, Geordi didn't react as much to her death. After making sure she was dead, he collected the data chips and left. The others were standing beside the pressure door that led to the next section. As he approached, Geordi felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. What were they waiting for? He couldn't think of any good reason. "The controls are jammed," Tavarian said. "I do not know the overrides for this model." Geordi went up to the door. One glance at the telltales confirmed his worst fears. "It's not jammed. The controls are on security lockout." He turned and faced his classmates. "The next section is flooded."